Good evening, everybody. Hello. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming on a snowy day. First of all, could everybody put their phones on the silent mode, please? And welcome at event number 13 of the POA. So before I will introduce the speaker of this evening, just a kind of very brief word on the framework of the POA. The POA has been established by Scrap Marshall, fourth year student, and myself, fifth year student. And it is a self-determining kind of framework for a public program here at the Architectural Association. We are set up as an agency, so we aim to be a practice service serving other practices, and we do so by staging events. As part of this kind of enterprise, we publish a preview and a review document of each event, which collide in this book, which you can get at the AA bookstore downstairs. This term we've had 4 events, of which this is the last one. So we started with Noor Periperini, who talked about the role of commodities in the making of the city. Then we had Kai van Hasselt, who speculated on how externalities can be used in urban design. And last Thursday, Meta Haven spoke about the possibility of an uncorporate identity. Tonight, we are very pleased to introduce to you Arnold Reijndorp. Arnold is an independent researcher at the cutting edge of urbanism and architecture and social and cultural developments in the urban field. At the moment, he holds the Lammers Chair of Social Economic Developments of New Urban Areas at the University of Amsterdam, and he's associated with the International Newtown Institute in Almere. With Maarten Hajer, he published the book In Search of New Public Domain, which I personally highly recommend. Then he kind of co-authored in Dutch the Atlas of the Western Garden Cities of Amsterdam and Theme Communities Living in Imaginated Places. Tonight's lecture is called The City as a Performance. I will leave it to Arnold to kind of introduce this topic. Please join me in welcoming Arnold Reijndorp to the AA.
Everybody understand? Is it loud enough? Yep. Test. Is it working? Right. Yeah. Okay. I'm very delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me. It's a few years ago that I was in the AA school here at a seminar, and I once was a reviewer of I think the third of 4th year. It's also a very high honor, I understood. But I was there because Kees Christiaans couldn't make it, so they invited me. What I'm going to do is to talk about the city as performance, and that's, in fact, what I'm trying to do is making a connection between the 2 books that were shown by Jan, between the book on In Search of New Public Domain, and the last book that was published a few months ago. 2 months ago, I think, on this kind of themed residential areas. And what we see there in these 2 subjects, in these 2 items, the search of new public domain and the themed environments, is in fact the shift, I think, from a very old metaphor of the city, the city as theater to the city as a performance. And I'm going to elaborate on that difference, but maybe you can understand some of it, that when you think about a city as a theater, you think about architecture and urbanism as a kind of a stage. And you think about the people living in the cities and walking in the cities as the actors and as the audience at the same time. And when you're talking about a performance, that is more like following a script or following what's written in a script or is designed on a storyboard. So I think it is an important shift from also a more informal view on cities to a formalization of certain atmospheres and certain places and places connected also to a kind of behavior that is preferred on these places. So that's the main line in the story. So I will talk about this a bit, about the shift from theater to performance. In the second part, I tell you something about the difference between public space and public domain, as we have written about it. The third part is going to be about the public and the crowd. What is in fact the public in public space of public domain? The fourth part is about the shift from collective spaces to parochial realms. And parochial realms, that is a very urban sociologist term. I'll come to that. Then we come to the fifth point. We get a bit deeper in on the theme parks and the themed neighborhoods. And the sixth part, and I was a bit uncertain if I could do this on controlled uncontrolled, because that's in fact a term that comes out of the project for a fun palace from Cedric Price. And Cedric Price once was, I think, a very famous also professor here in the AA. And maybe it's a kind, for most students nowadays, it's a kind of old stuff from the 70s. But I think it's still a very interesting concept to bring back to the discussion. Okay, let's start with the theater. Maybe you know it. There is a very, now not very famous architect from the Renaissance times, an Italian, Sebastian Serlio. He is not very famous from his buildings, because he didn't build very much. Maybe in architectural history you have seen this strange stairs in Fontainebleau, that is from Serlio. But he was a writer on architecture. He wrote the complete works on architecture and perspective, and he wrote one of these books about architecture and theater, because in his work, theater settings, the stage settings, were also very important to understand something about the architecture of the city. And he distinguished three kinds of theater settings. The first one was the setting, the set for the tragedy, and that are the monumental buildings of the city. So the palaces, the city hall, the prison, all kind of monumental buildings. And the tragedy is of course about power, maybe about love sometimes, but also about hate, about treason. That's are all the elements of the tragedy. And the monumental buildings are in his works the setting for the scenery for this kind of performance, you could say. It's also about eroticism. There is, I don't know when, but I think 30 years ago I started with one postcard from Paris, a couple kissing in the city, and I became a collector, and then all your friends are going to help you and send you this postcard. So I think I have 150 postcards of kissing in the city. It's a very interesting subject to study. And also the monumental buildings are, the public space is the stage for this kind of performance. Because kissing in your own neighborhood is not interesting. It's about kissing in the city. And there's also a kind of feeling for what urban space, public space is about, because there is a kind of familiarity and anonymity at the same time when you feel like kissing. It's about eroticism, and I said, and then the second one, that's about comedy. That's the stage set for the comedy. And the comedy is everyday life. It's that are the streets, the residential streets and small squares of the residential areas and neighborhoods of the city. And the comedy is also maybe sometimes also about the little tragedy, but it is also about misunderstandings. It is about ambitions of people. It is about failure. It is about hope. It is about that's the comedy. So that is the ordinary stage set of the streets. This is also, I think, this is a theater. This is that is a post-war area in Amsterdam. That is the one we did this atlas of the Western garden cities. Quite a normal square, and these older people, they when they were young, they went to this area that was new at that moment, and they stayed, and they're now old, and they're sitting there on the square as an audience, but what are they looking at? That's the question. They're looking at the new inhabitants of this residential area and the children. Migrant, immigrant people, Moroccan people, Turkish people, people from Suriname and the Dutch Antilles in Holland. And they keep distance and they perform a kind of a theater there. The childs are the performers and the older people are the audience. And I think also this is telling us something about the essence of public space, about public domain. Because what they are doing, these older people, is a bit reflecting. They are looking at the mothers, young mothers, the American mothers and their children. And they are reflecting, I think, on the educational skills of those mothers, and they are comparing it with themselves, what they did in their time. And they are, in fact, what they are doing is also reflecting on what you could say a multicultural society in that way. So this is, I think it's part of the comedy, but it's a very important part when you think about public space and public domain as a domain of cultural exchange, of people learning something about society, reflecting on it, looking at each other, keeping distance, maybe not talking with each other, but still using the same space. And what we observe is there's always theater. There's enormous theater, much theater in cities and in urban spaces everywhere. But you see a certain tendency, I said, to the performance, that the city is that the thing we see in cities is not a informal thing, people doing their thing and other people looking at it, but it is staged. It is part of a it is a result of a script or of a storyboard. This is Brandenvoort by Helmond. Helmond is a city in the southeast of Holland. It's built by architect Krier. And what you here see is that I think what most architects like the most is that people do adapt to the environment. Now these people is a bit are a bit exaggerating maybe, but what they do here is once in a year they organize the Dickens Night, and with this Dickens Night they they adapt in fact to the traditional architecture of the environment. And of course they don't walk around like this in the rest of the year. But the idea that you accept the environment like this, the traditional building, and you organize this Dickens Night like organization, that's very, I think it is a sign of a very deep adaptation to this traditional environment. There's some more pictures, and even the police is also going with it. Now the most normal explication of this kind of traditional architecture is that it's nostalgia. The society is becoming more and more difficult to understand. Are more and more conflicts. Are more and more newcomers in the society, immigrants, etc. It's more and more unsure and not to understand. And then people go back to their youth and they're becoming nostalgic of older times. And of course there are some on the marketing offices of the big developers. They go with this trend. This is the marketing of a neighborhood in Rotterdam, where your steps are your own steps again. So the old neighborhood where you once was a child, and now you are a grandfather and a grandmother, and your grandchild is coming to the new steps again. There's lots of progress made in this neighborhood, you could say, between these two pictures. The other one is, in fact, it's an arbeiderswijk, and a workers' neighborhood, and now it's an affluent family that's living there. But the idea is, you have the new neighborhood is connected to the feeling of at home and of a society that was not so difficult to understand as modern society. But I think that to understand the move from building a stage, architecture as a stage set, to architecture and urbanism as a performance, we have to understand more about this idea of public domain. That's my second part. When you that is, I think that that it's not new to tell you that there is a very strong tendency in the urban field of segregation of groups. People are very easily, some people can allow themselves to live among themselves in this kind of areas. Other people are obliged to do the same, that not by choice maybe, but by lack of choice. They live in other areas. The question is then, I think in modern society, where do they meet? Where are the places in cities today where these two worlds come together? And in the book on In Search of New Public Domain, Maarten Hajer and I were looking for it. It was a search for new public domain, because when you read books about public domain, it's most of the times it's about old public domain, the squares and parks of the cities. But we were interested in all kinds of new phenomena as theme parks, malls, big malls, and other stations of the transport system as a kind of a new places where people are connected to each other. And we thought about these kind of places as places of cultural exchange. It's my favorite photo from the book, and also much readers, I think, like the photo. And it is, I think, also that is also the very essential to understand what is happening. In Holland, we have a urban policy that is very much aimed at mixing. We are always trying to mix different groups of people in neighborhoods and in cities, etc., etc. We are in Holland. We are very against people living apart and not meeting other groups. When you look at these policies, then you get the idea that people don't like to see other people, that people don't like to go to places where they meet other things. And I think that's simply not true, because people are curious. People are curious, going to holidays, going to places, etc. But they also have for them to go to those places, it's necessary to have the idea that these places are also safe. There has to have a certain thrill in the public space, but there is also you have to have the feeling of safety. And this is, of course, a very traditional role model here, shown in this photo. The father taking the part of the curious, and the mother the safety side of the picture. But that's not necessarily so. I think that it's important, and yet you always have that I'm an optimist, and what makes me optimistic is that this idea of curiosity, that people always are curious to see things they don't know, and they are going to places that they think we can find some extraordinary things and things we haven't seen before. But the important thing is also that people like to be secure. The second thing about public space is that it is always about cultural exchange and public familiarity. It is the cultural exchange is the thing about what you don't know that you are interested in, but you have also what very important is this feeling of familiarity, a familiar environment. That you have the idea that the strangers that are in the environment, that are a kind of a known strangers. Strangers, that familiarity, it is not that you know the people because they are neighbors, or you know the people because they are friends or family. No, they are strangers, but you are familiar but with their behavior or with their aspirations. And it's about conflict. And this picture also makes the links to the next part of my lecture, because what you see here is, I think it's public domain, but formally it's a private environment, because this is Schiphol Plaza, what is in fact not a public space. It is a private space owned by the airport company. But it's also an airport city. It's in the intention, the ambition of the airport company is it also an airport city, and it is a place where demonstrations are held, because this is also the place where the ministers and politicians, etc., arrive. So, public domain does not equal formal public space. Formal public space is owned by the government and is open for everybody. But public domain can also be a shopping mall or an airport or a large station of the railway, and this kind of places. It can also be like this, an outlet center in a new town in Holland. Or maybe it could be a big food court in a shopping mall in the Ruhr area in Germany. I think you know this map of Rome. I think that's you're acquainted with it, but that's the idea. That it is also not, it is not mainly the streets and the squares and the parks, but also the public space in buildings like churches in that time, and city halls and palaces, etc., that together make an interesting public domain. The third part of the lecture, the public and the crowd. Who is the public that is are the users of the public realm? Who is the public? I'm teaching urban sociology, thus I couldn't help to bring a book with me from Robert Park from the pioneer sociologist of the Chicago School of Urban Sociology in the beginning of the 20th century. And he wrote his dissertation in Germany about the crowd and the public. And that was, I think, was a very, very important distinction at that time, and it still is. The public is not everybody. The public is not you and me and everyone outside. The public is a very specific kind of people, a very specific group of the population. And public space is, I think, was in the 19th century and in the 20th century very much a public space of a certain group, a certain public. And now, and that is the following, that I'll go deeper in the following part of my lecture, it's also a very divided space for new publics. These terms, I think, are very important. You have the public, that's the group of the population that is the users are and the people that know how to behave in public space. You have the crowd that mostly was seen as a very dangerous group of people, which you didn't know, but you were afraid of. People living in the narrow streets and in the underground world of the cities, and the masses. The masses, the effect, and when the crowd organizes themselves and become a very political factor. I think this is a very good citation that makes clear how this thinking in the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, was developing. Crowds were bad citizens, mass and isolated individuals were weak and vulnerable citizens, and publics were good citizens. And I think that when we think about the public nowadays, you still have this kind of differences. Hooligans are not good public, not good citizens. Public, the public are certain groups. Very shortly, I want mention the differences between the great cities of that time, Paris and London, in the way public domain was developed in that time. This is of course Paris, with the boulevards, and the interesting thing, of course, about the boulevard is it's always said it was military reasons, etc., that they were they were made, but they are of course very interesting because here was a new public space for the public of the new citizen, the new bourgeoisie, was made by cutting a space through the older neighborhoods. And so, as a result, you get a situation of a public domain that was more heterogeneous, more populated by different people than what you have here, I think, in London, where we're now sitting in Bloomsbury, with the squares and the regions that were exactly developed for the kind of public, the good citizens that were mentioned in these the citation I showed you. And this mixing of groups in the cities at that time, that also went to the development of the design of the houses. This is of course a typical Paris apartment building, and you all know the pictures of the poor artist in the attic and the bourgeois people living on the first and the second floors. So also in this kind of buildings you had this mix, and in contrast the typical city house, the urban residential housing of the good citizens of the public here in Bloomsbury. And also in the more in the sphere in the atmosphere of leisure, here is the in the Paris situation, the situation of the brasserie and the bistro were more mixed, also in the sense of the in the sense of gender, but also in terms of middle class and high middle class, and the gentleman's club as a kind of a segregated public domain here in London. I make this very short excursion to show you that what here in London in fact was being created was not public domain, but a collective domain of the people living in these areas. And the strange thing is that with the development of modern urbanism, modern urban planning and architecture, this kind of collective spaces became the spaces of the working class areas, the new working class areas in a city like Amsterdam. Maybe you have been there, you know it. It's the Spaarndammer buurt in the east side, on the east side of the city center. There's the city center. And you have this collective space that is, it seems to be defended by a higher wall from city life. The French architectural theoreticians Castex and De Paul, they've written on this kind of changes that were made in the cities at that moment. This is some strange thing that the collective spaces of the gender in London became the collective space of the emancipation of the working classes in cities in Western Europe. After the war, these collective spaces as emancipation, spaces of emancipation, the domain of emancipation of the working classes became the normal way of developing the newer areas in the post-war housing policy. And the difference between the collective spaces between the houses and the public space of the city has vanished, you could say. collective space is everywhere. And the the difference between this collective space as the space of the residents, the space of the all kind of institutions that were operating as agents for the emancipation of the working class, they were very dominant in this kind of building this kind of housing schemes that we are now trying to reconstruct and trying to revitalize. And public space, as a space of cultural exchange, you could say, was minimized and maybe absolutely not there anymore. These are the collective spaces nowadays, and they are again used, I think, also used for by the newer inhabitants of these areas, but they are very much the spaces of the residents that are living in. And it's a very ironic, in fact, that we are now back by the new gentry, that the collective space, that gated communities is in fact gated communities of this kind of private residential areas. They are in fact the continuation of the collective spaces that were so central in modern housing architecture and modern urbanism, but now again for quite another group. When you look to when you move away from the residential areas to the larger scale of the city, then you see an interesting sociological phenomenon. You see that there is still a kind of collectivity, but that collectivity is no longer connected to the neighborhood, to certain residential spaces, the residential areas. Parochial, the term parochial is introduced by Lynn Loveland. Lynn Loveland is an American urban sociologist, and she she introduced the concept, the term, because there is something between private and public, and that is the parochial space. The parochial space is a space of people that know each other a bit. They are not family, they are not friends, they are not neighbors, but they are one of, can you say that? They are from the same kind, the same sort of, same kind of people. And in the 50s, maybe still in the 60s, these parochial realms, they were more or less the same as the collective spaces in the different neighborhoods. But now a parochial realm of a certain group is a verzameling. What is verzameling? A collection is a collection of very different spaces. It can be a kind of cafes, restaurants, theaters, galleries, etc., etc. So the parochial realm of the immigrant population of a big city, and the gay population of the older population of the skateboard population, etc. Very different. They use very different places in the city, and the collection of that is their parochial realm. Parochial realms can also be realms can also be temporary. What you see here, that a street in a city can be once a week, Wednesday, the parochial realm of the skaters. After that, it's again normal public space, you could say. This is only to show you how difficult it is to understand, because this is a scheme from the work of Pierre Bourdieu in his book The Distinction, La Distinction. He was the first one to recognize these cultural differences between groups, not only class differences in economic sense, but for the differences in cultural capital between groups that were, in fact, they made a distinction between groups, and you could say that the parochial realms are the cultural spaces that are that make for that make the distinction from one group to another. Now, just some pictures to illustrate some kind of differences you have. But the essential is that the public domain, and that's the I think that the thing we in our search for new public domain, Maarten Hajer and I developed, is the idea that public domain is in fact the experience of the parochial realm of another group. When you are moving around in the city, then on a certain moment you are on strange territory, you could say, on unknown territory. Then you have the feeling that you are in the parochial realm of another group, and that is in fact the experience of public domain. And public domain develops where parochial domains interfere or overlap. So when you move around through a city, you can stay, I think you as a student can stay for very long and a very wide range in your own parochial domain. The kind of cafes, the kind of theaters, the kind of films, the kind of all kinds of things you are visiting. But there are some environments that these parochial domains interfere with each other or overlap. And that makes it interesting. So this is an example of this kind of a very theatrical stage. This is the skate park in the city where I live, in Rotterdam, where in the central business district is also on the boulevard a skate park. And the owners of the offices, they were in fact against it, because they were afraid that the prices of their property would shrink. And it's only due to a very liberal judge that said, in the zoning plan, this is a green area, and I see this kind of leisure activities also as a green area. So he allowed the skate park initiative to go along, and now everybody's very happy. Also the owners of the offices, because the place is far more interesting, and this is a kind of a interference of different parochial domains on a certain spot. That's what you see here in the middle. That is more or less a footnote. Wacht even. In this, when you have to realize that when you move around in the city, that you have a kind of a problem. How do you recognize your own parochial realm, and how do you recognize that it's not a parochial realm? This is a kind of a symbolic economy, as Sharon Sukin has called it in the Cultures of Cities. And in the symbolic economy, some groups in the city are putting a stamp on it. And there is also, like in the normal economic economy, there's also competition. There's a competition between the symbols of different groups. And there are stronger groups with stronger symbols, and there are weaker groups with weaker symbols. And one of these stronger groups, that's the group that you are such a group, because you are the most popular group, I think, that in city policy, the favorite creative class. This is a map of Amsterdam that is trying to indicate where the favorite creative class areas are. And that is a certain part of the cities, and the symbols of it. If you don't know, maybe you don't know in a city you have never been there, where these creative class areas are, but when you arrive there, you know immediately. This kind of image is very strong. But what's happening in the rest of the city? That was the question we asked us. How is public domain developing in... Oh, wacht even, deze plaatje zat er eventjes. Dus dat is this was a former working class area in the Pijp in Amsterdam. And now it is this image. And I think this is the very preferred image of urbanity nowadays. But in fact, and very much there are many people that call this kind of urbanity also the urbanity of the city. This is the symbol of urbanity at the moment. But when you have to realize that this is in fact not, in our terms, not a public, but a parochial domain. And it is, as I said, a very dominant one. But what is happening outside these red colored areas? We did this in this atlas for the garden cities of Amsterdam. We try to map the new public domain by looking into ways of life and living worlds. And it's interesting what you see, these two pictures. These are two pictures of the same street, but on different moments. Dus the street can be an immigrant shopping street at one moment, and in another moment it can be a shopping street for the people, the more traditional inhabitants that live there now for 30 years. And that mapping this kind of different worlds, we're looking at roots, routines, and rituals. People have their daily routines of shopping, of going to work, etc. But they're also following certain routes. And they have also rituals, and there can be some festivities, but also things like marriage and also, of course, funerals. And we did it with very different techniques, this kind of mapping. These are mental maps. You may be acquainted with the work of Kevin Lynch. This is this kind of mental mapping. In fact, these are 3 or 4 mental maps from a American woman, a mother. And it seems to confirm that the world of that lady is very small, from that group is very small. But this map is a map of another Moroccan immigrant woman with a student, and that is not an. We simply asked people to draw a picture, a drawing of their neighborhood. Now here is the neighborhood very small, and here it is. The neighborhood is something like a big part of Amsterdam. That is a more traditional inhabitant of the same area, and he sketched also a more complicated area of all kinds of things he's doing with his little garden and the friends living there and his clubs. And these are what we do. We have what we call new urbanites, the higher educated urban families, and that man draws it more like a kind of a Disneyland map. So this is gives you a first idea of these different worlds, and then we tried to map the parochial domains of those groups with simply mapping their shops, their clubs, all these kind of services, and other services. And by doing so, and then we tried to indicate where do the worlds meet, where do they interfere, where do they overlap, and then chain stores, the ordinary chain stores, they seems to have a very important function for creating new public domain. Rituals, I told you about the rituals. That is the right upper corner is the free market for Queen's Day in Holland, but there is also, of course, the ferry, the kermis and the funerals, and they also create new public domain. And then is the overlap of the regional, national, and international scales in the city that connect the area with the city as a whole and with the world. And together, that's a research we did in that's very extensive labor to do such research. But then, as a result, you get some indication where in this areas, these post-war residential areas, new public domain is developing in a urban scheme that is in fact very much based on the collective spaces, as I explained to you earlier. Then the city as a themed performance. So in this part we have get some feeling for what is the public domain in terms of theater. But now again back to the city as performance. This is not England. This is China. Maybe some had already seen it. It's a very good imitation, I think. It's one of the new towns in the neighborhood of Shanghai. And it's also very empty. Nobody's living there. It is made for the new middle classes in China. And the houses are all sold, but nobody's living there at the moment. There is some reason for this kind of architecture. It has to appeal to people, to a new identity. It appeals to a group that is forming itself. It's not a group with a very clear understanding of itself. It is a new middle class. And the developers in China, the communist developers of China, they try to make this way, with this kind of an architecture, a a kind of a feeling of identity, a feeling of identity that is can be adapted by those new middle classes in Chinese society. Jamestown it's called. And this is the adaptation. That is, I think that's always funny that people adapt the environment, of course, to their own ideas. And you see here, it's also a Chinese. This could also be a Chinese household in really in an English village or something. Back to Brandenvoort. And I told you, it is not about tradition, but what are the two examples, Brandenvoort in Helmond in Holland and Jamestown in China, they have in common that they are both trying to appeal to a new middle class group, which is in fact uncertain about itself. It doesn't know its style, it doesn't know its task. It's looking, it is searching for a kind of a new environment, a new architecture that tells them something about the other members of their same group, the same status group. So I think it's the whole idea of this shift from theater to performance. It's not about nostalgia, but it is about identity, uncertainty, and it is also about control. But not about control in terms of a gated community, that's about security, but control in the sense that people, I try to explain it on the other example. This is also an example of a themed community. Unlike Brandenvoort, it is not an extension of a city. This is a themed community in the inner city area. In fact, the environment here is a very multicultural area with lots of immigrants, Moroccan, Turkish, Cape Verdean, living in that area. In Dutch housing policies, these areas are being reconstructed with the aim to upgrade them, to attract also people with higher income and higher education to these areas, or to try to people that are bettering their situation in these areas, immigrants that are prosperous, etc., keeping them in these areas, and in fact challenging them to buy houses in these areas. And then these people, they have a kind of a dilemma, because you can say most of these people, they like to live in these kind of multicultural situation because they are for themselves, they have the feeling that they are kind of a progressive modern urbanites, but they have a problem, they have a dilemma, because they can buy a house, but it can also be that they are the only one, or there are very few like them, so that it is not a success, but a failure in several years. And this kind of dilemma is, I think, is one of the things that the marketeers and the developers try to solve for them. In fact, architecture here is saying something like, when you like this kind of project, there are others like you who also like this architecture and this project. Thus, they try to produce a kind of certainty, a kind of an architectural and an urbanistic certainty for people that it will be a success, because they will attract people like yourself. And the whole marketing strategy is also, the architecture and the urbanistic plan and the marketing strategy includes also all kind of parties for the new residents and the buyers, etc., to give them this feeling. Now this is then the contrast with the neighborhood, and these are the newer and older shops and cafes in the neighborhood, and this is the inside of the project. So in fact, it is a collective domain. It's also the public space is owned by the owners of the houses. It is open to the public. There is a possibility to close it at night. You could say in terms of parochial, in terms of parochial domain, it's part of a parochial domain of a certain high educated urban middle class, but it is also connected with the parochial domains of the immigrants, etc. They're also living there in this area. The more affluent immigrants are living here. So it is, in my terms, in my definition, it is part of a public domain because it is overlapping and integrating these kind of parochial domains. And still there is some strange feeling you have with this kind of areas, because they are so staged, they are so perfectly made, that there is a kind of an expectation by the residents that they live up to the expectation of what the storyboard of the marketeers have told them. And there is a very much also a feeling, and that's in the Brandenvoort area more than in this Rotterdam project, I must say. But there is a feeling that you also have the right to correct behavior that is not in the script, it's not in the storyboard. So in Brandenvoort there are a kind of a small, very little conflicts about people sitting for the front door on the streets, because that reminds other people on the more popular culture of the working class city. They had left because they were now middle class people, and then people sitting on the streets is not convenient with that idea. And in fact, sitting on the street is in the big cities of Holland, in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, is in fact very much done by this new middle classes. So there is in their idea of this middle class identity, there is some ambiguity, some ambivalence. What is done and what is not done, and that it is maybe some very small conflicts, but there are some very strange things going on in this kind of areas, and that's what I in the flyer, in the small summary of my my lecture, I call that this a kind of a mirror, and that's then maybe that is also the important difference between the metaphor of the theater, the city as a theater, because then you are looking at other people and are enjoying what you see, and in this kind of urban areas as performance, you are in fact are looking for and looking at yourself. You are looking for the same people, the same behavior as yourself, and so in fact you are looking in a mirror. So now my last part, and that's the beginning also with the Veste Fun Palace, a project by Cedric Price. And what I find interesting in this, the project is never realized. It is also not the aim of the project that it was realized. in Holland we had some of it in some project by an architect called Van Klingeren. He made some from leisure centers, and the idea was that public space is the result of conflicts. So what he did was make some big spaces without walls, and the idea of it was that when you in one part of the in this hall you play Mozart string quartets, and on the other part you have a kind of sport activities like basketball or something, then you have really public space. The conflict is public space. That was a bit too far, and all this kind of buildings are now reconstructed and rebuilt with walls, etc., with kind of a multifunctional accommodations with all kind of rooms in it. But it was also a misunderstanding of the idea, I think, of Cedric Price. The Cedric Price idea was that you could maybe, not with architectural means, but with differences in atmospheres and in climates, etc., you could provoke people to do certain things on certain places in your building. So not by walls and by lights, by humidity, about temperature, about materials, etc. You could provoke people to do different things. And I think that is in fact connected to the third stage setting of Serlio, and that's the satire. If I pronounce it right in English, satire. The Serlio connects that stage, that idea of that theater form, with green areas, not the green areas outside the city, but the green areas in the city. So the parks, and in fact, the parks, the leftovers of the landscape when the city is extending, is growing, then the certain parts of the landscape became involved in the city and are reconstructed designed as parks or other green areas. And it is also about what Victor Turner has called the anti-structure of the city. So these are the things that turn things on topsy-turvy is the term. The things topsy-turvy. That is the anti-structure of the city. The structure is the normal work, etc. But the rituals, the demonstrations, the carnival, etc., the fair, that is the anti-structure, and that is people are in fact trying to criticize, but on a playful manner, what's happening. This is in fact really a demonstration, but there are no demonstrations allowed in Disneyland, of course. So the demonstration is outside, but direct in front of the thing, and on a playful way, this is a kind of an example of the anti-structure, maybe of the theme park. What it is about is, I think, and that was the importance of the project of Cedric Price. It is about legibility of places and unwritten rules. How do you read a place? How do you read what you are? What the designer is thinking that you have to do there. What is the right behavior? And I think that is in our cities, that is a very important object of study, because lots of places we have designed in the last decades, they are in fact not legible, they are not readable, because people can't know what they ought to do there, or what is behavior that is in touch with what is in what is in what it let's let me say so. It's not clear anymore when you are in public space what is awaited from you as a good citizen, as a part of the public. There is no clue for that kind of for the right behavior. Now, a few examples that is maybe it's not so difficult to reconstruct this kind of design knowledge again. This is a project by Lina Bobardi in Sao Paulo, you might know. It's a large leisure center, and in Brazil it's enough to make this kind of design to give people the feeling that they are on a beach. And but that is very strange. You say, okay, yeah, of course, but it's very strange that people are in their bathing suit lying in a old industrial area on the ground, maybe drinking wine or beer. What is in most situations not allowed in cities. And it's not so Brazilian, because this is Rotterdam. This is a quite normal and most of the times very empty quay on the river. And the simple thing that you put some sand on it, and people say, hey, it looks like a beach, and they behave like it. And I think that's very, very intriguing. This kind of behavior in such a situation. This people have in their mental, in their head, they have some idea about materials, about how things look, and what kind of behavior you are allowed to do there or not. Here, two girls sitting on a square on the ground, somebody playing music. It's not allowed in most city squares. But this is the clue. When you simply roll some of these garden rolls over the square, then you have, in fact, you make from a square a park. And in a park you can do other things than are allowed in a square. So this can be, that is for the discussion maybe, these are some clues that I think that it is some examples of what Cedric Price, I think in the 70s, was looking for, atmospheres, materials that give people a clue for their behavior in public space. And when you when you understand this kind of things, then you have more, I think, more material, more techniques than what the people, developers and architects and urbanists now are using to build these stage sets, make these storyboards, and they make, in fact, not a controlled uncontrol, but they make a controlled control. And that's what I think we have to look for, an opening, because it is that controlled control, it is a solution for the dilemma we're in, because most of the people don't understand what you have, what behavior is correct in certain places. But when you are just designing it in a way that is only controlling, then it is in fact again a source for all kinds of conflicts between people. And in the uncontrolled situation, the controlled uncontrolled is what are the conditions you have to control so that people feel free to act uncontrolled. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Arnold. Let's open it up to questions immediately. Are there questions from the audience? Not just yet. I have one kind of maybe practical question. You ended on the notion of the uncontrolled, and I am wondering if you can maybe through an example explain how you might convince a developer who is often out for a very controlled scheme, the potential of the uncontrolled.
Now first show these examples, because the square I showed you is the small garden, the artificial garden. That is a square that is from the post-war period. It's in Nijmegen, a city that was bombed by accident by British bombers. They thought it was a German city, but it was a Dutch city. So they created space for a square, and there is a square, but the people are discussing it now for 50 years, and the square is still not a square people like and want. And that is, I think, the power of this image, that you can very easily organize it in another way. And in my mind, it triggers also the very large division between squares and parks, because squares are public spaces that are maybe very good in organizing conflicts, and parks on the other way, parks are very good in organizing conflicts in a way that people are with it live. I think in a strange way they do all kind of activities together, but on a distance. Parks give you the possibility to stay on your own, with your own group in a park, and keep your distance. And in squares, you are pressed together, and that is a very conflictual situation. You can't have this idea of distance. And when you have the idea of distance, when you have the possibility of this distance, then it becomes a very empty square. And a park is never empty, because it's green. It is also, without people, it is a good situation. So that is one clue, but there must be more. I think it's a kind of on architectural schools of architecture. In my experience, I don't know all the schools of the world, of course. In my experience, it's a part of the craftsmanship of designers that we have lost, and it is not taught. We design. There is I don't know the author, but it is one book on public space that the author writes. What we need is not design, but we need a redesign. There's a new understanding of science, and not our understanding, but looking at the understanding of people of kind of science. If you understand what I mean.
Are there questions from the audience now? Hugo.
I think it's very interesting that in trying to explore what public domain is, there's a strong element there of the need for people to coexist who are quite different. This question of parochial boundaries overlapping, which seems to be very rich and something that perhaps is being lost in more over-designed spaces. But how far do you take the idea of conflict you're using it generally in a sort of negative sense, that you know, the square in a way creates the possibility of spaces of conflict. The park is more able to absorb difference and perhaps stop that conflict. But do you think that there's a role, in a way, of designers and people thinking about public space to somehow be concerned about and trying to prevent conflict? Or do you see that, in fact, a level of conflict is, in fact, necessary and part of the creative, productive element of any urban condition, that you don't actually want to eradicate conflict, but the conflict isn't always a negative?
No, what I'm looking for, searching for, is in fact space for conflict. That means every space is when you place two people in a small room, there will become a conflict after a few days. But it is, I think you shouldn't. The conflict is not something you want. I mean, the conflict is inherent. The conflict is inherent in the fact that there are people that belong to different groups with different lifestyles and different attitudes and different behavior. And the meaning of public space in terms of public domain is also that this conflict is open, that you can see what other people do and that they are doing it in another way as you. And but the conflict, my argument is that a specific public space can also generate a kind of conflicts that is not a conflict to people, but it is a misunderstanding of the right behavior in these places. When you have this large, in Holland at last, but in several, also in France and also in Britain, you have these large residential, post-war residential areas with all these large, indifferent green spaces. Older people that live there for 30 years, 50 years, they don't like youngsters to ride along there with their scooters, etc. But you can't say that that is not a right interpretation of the place. Why shouldn't you, in such an enormous green space, why shouldn't you be allowed to ride on a scooter through this kind of... There is a reference to, no, it is a collective space and it is the space of everybody, and you have you can sit you can sit there on the ground in the greenery, etc. But nobody's doing it. So there is not a reading. That's the same as in shopping areas. There are nowadays there are in most shopping of these shopping areas, not only in shopping malls but also in inner city shopping areas, there are conflicts with youngsters hanging around and the people that like to shop and the owners of the shops. But there is no good argument why these youngsters are not right in doing what they do, because they simply use the space as it always was, as a public space. And it is in fact the claim of the shoppers and the shopkeepers that it is a shopping area what is wrong. It was always public space, not a shopping area, but public space. So that's what I'm talking about. It's how legible, how readable are our environments, and what is the legitimation of the one reading against the other reading of what is the right behavior in those places.
And just to follow up on that, the legibility, do you think that that's something which spatial design and qualitative space, the actual skill of the designer, can make a big difference to legibility, or is legibility read in quite different ways that are not explicitly about?
No, it is not only a question of design, it's also a question of program, I think, yeah. When you have a street with only shops, then it is, but actually it is also always the idea that the shopping street is also a nice place to go and drink a beer and not only shop. But it is also about program. But in our book, In Search for New Public Domain, we have one peculiar example, that is the Tompkins Square in South Manhattan, in East Village. There's lots of books written about Tompkins Square. And in fact, it's not a square, it is a small park. And it was closed down by the police at a certain moment, because it was mainly used by drugs abusers and alcoholics, etc. But then the residential population, the older residential population, but also the more squatting-like younger population, also they demonstrated against the closing down of that park, because they said, yeah, okay, but it's also our park. And the solution was to divide the park in different parts, making gates around the different parks, different small green areas and other areas. And in fact, this way is a kind of a coexistence to make a situation that a spatial, clear, for everybody readable situation. From you can, with your dogs, you can sit there, the alcoholics on the there, the people with little children there. Yeah, that's not my ideal of a lovely, attractive public space, but it is a solution, and on a very straight, direct way for what's going on there. So that was also the reason that we, on a bit provocative way, said for gates for public domain. You can also create public domain with gates, and that the gates have also, by parks, gates have also always a very symbolic. It's a very symbolic instrument to say, from you are now, when you have a park with a gate around, it gives you the sign that you